Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and yeah, it's a Lancer video. I know it's been a minute. A lot's been going on, honestly. But I'm not gonna get into it. Let's talk about the Zheng here, right? The Zheng. This is such an interesting mech. It's probably the most like narrative based mech in Lancer, at least to date. Even though I know a lot of them really do have a lot of deep lore, this mech in particular, from design to practice, is based on essentially a narrative they came up for the long rim. This mech is a modified Rayleigh, which is why I actually hate the design. I would really like. I understand in lore the mechs don't have to look like the defaults that we see in the book. These are just examples, but the examples give us a good idea of what we want to design our mech around, and this mech just looks exactly like the story would entail. It is a cobbled together mess that should barely function and is not long for the battlefield. But design wise, it's interesting, but it's a cobbled together mess. Like that's the intent. I just wish that because the Zhang itself in lore becomes like a standard frame type after the events of Zheng Zhaoli's story. You can read kind of behind me here that they would have like spruced it up a little bit. That's just a complaint on the design. I think the mech is very interesting. It's a striker mech that has some interesting kind of a little. It's the embodiment of strength. It's a punch mech. It does a lot of punching, which is really cool. I'm a big pugilist fan myself, and in addition to that, it has a lot of kind of pseudo grappling in its build, and as well, it has some of the unstoppable nature of the Caliban, at least to a feel. It doesn't really compete with, like, say, the Blackbeard or the Caliban in either of their specific departments. It's a very baseline, I think, strong mech. You want to make a mech that's like very beefy feeling. This license is probably the way you want to go. So let's go ahead and take a look at the stats so you can see a little bit more of what I'm talking about. So starting off here, we can see this is a slightly more armored mech, having 2 armor and 10 HP, which is more than average, with a little bit of a boost to evasion, but a very bad E defense. So this mech is very much designed to be a very nuts and bolts kind of mech. It doesn't do well with any kind of tech at all. I mean, you can see here it has a -2 tech attack, and it has a sensor range of 3, making it the lowest sensor range available to mechs, or at least one of the lowest, depending on when you're viewing this particular video, because who knows, what future mechs might come out. Now, T capacity is a little bit above average, as well as its repair, or no, it's on the high end of average, with a repair capacity a little bit above average. Decent save target. It's a slow mech, kind of. There is I would say that the speed is very deceptive, because while it is a little bit on the slower side, it has a feature that makes it go faster regularly. So I would actually count the Zhang as actually being a genuinely fast mech, but you do need to be careful with its extra movement. Again, a feature we'll talk about here in a bit, and it has lower than average system points, so there's not a lot you're going to be able to fit in software wise or even some weapon wise. This mech just doesn't have a lot of systems to go off of, which makes a lot of sense for its lore. So from what we can see here, we have a standard kind of brawler mech, not a full-on tank Guardian style mech, even though it has similar Guardian style stats. It's designed to be able to survive with its own force on the battlefield, but it suffers heavily against any tech-based attacks, and this mech is very inflexible. You're only going to be using it predominantly for system or for weapons and whatever maneuvers you do. You're not going to be using any kind of tech or systems or anything that require sensor range, as your sensor range is utterly pitiful. So a really good mech overall for IPS North Star, which is where this mech comes from. So let's take a look at the traits, because this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So first we have destructive swings. We have a unique trait here that doesn't do what a lot of traits tend to do. So what happens is when you make at least one melee attack, which you're probably going to do a lot with this mech, against a hostile character, the force of your swing creates a size 1 piece of terrain that grants hard cover and a free adjacent space. So it's at the end of your turn, this space is created adjacent to you. Now, this piece of terrain does act as hard cover, and this is a really good way to protect our mech from any kind of danger from the outside. And I didn't mention this earlier, but this is a size 1 mech, so size 1 terrain is perfect for hiding this mech. I wouldn't make this mech too much bigger than size 1, honestly, as this is a really good feature because this just makes it so range fire, which if you're going a very melee heavy build, is going to be your biggest weakness. So just the ability to just every turn create hard cover for yourself is actually an insanely good feature. It's actually really, really cool. And in addition to this, it has weak computers. So it has a difficulty on all system saves and checks, making it, again, incredibly vulnerable to being hacked and all that kind of stuff. So this mech is a mech you want to use against maybe like space pirates, but maybe not even space pirates necessarily. Any kind of like against kaiju or large life forms, this is really, really good. But against other kind of mech enemies of some type, this is a very like vulnerable mech to a lot of different playstyles. So this, you have to take this mech in with a very sure idea of what you're going up against. So, you know, out of combat, try to figure out what kind of enemies you're going to be going up against, because this mech can get messed up really, really bad. But because destructive swings is such an insanely powerful, I mean, when you consider destructive swings, as long as you're making melee attacks, which means this mech really wants to be using melee, you're going to be getting essentially hard cover, which is giving enemies difficulty to shoot you through the hard cover, more or less. That's really, really good, honestly. That's a very powerful feature, in addition to the fact that we have so much HP and really good armors as well. But I will say that if you want to use this mech in any other style, like if you want to play a gun style mech of any kind, you're not going to want to use the Zheng. Zheng is pretty much exclusively a melee mech, and that's really the way you should design it. And actually, speaking on what kind of weapons you should use here, we have 2 main mounts and a heavy mount, which is a little rough. A lot of mechs out there have a main mount and a flex mount plus a heavy mount. So this mech already kind of has not a great gun style of mount loadout. It can use 1 super heavy weapon and a main weapon, or 2 main weapons and a heavy weapon. There are a lot of different combinations of different weapons you could use for this style that you could still have like a range option for. But you do need to be really careful, especially when you're using a super heavy weapon, because if that super heavy weapon is not a melee weapon, you're not going to get the benefits of destructive swings, which is really, really rough. Now, going down here to the bottom, we have our Zheng type CQB suite. This is our core system, and this is Zhao Li's Tenacity is actually a passive we get. Zhao Li was the pilot. Well, Zhao Li Zheng, as I mentioned before, was the pilot for this mech, so it's all kind of a ode to that pilot that made this particular mech. Zhao Li's Tenacity is that speed feature that I was mentioning before. So essentially what it does is once per turn as a free action, we can move up to 3 spaces and deal 2 kinetic damage to any adjacent characters we are next to, or 10 kinetic AP damage to any objects we end up next to. I'm going to hide my cam real quick so we can read the rest here. Now, it's really weird because it says this movement prompts engagement and does not ignore reactions. That should be a given. That text is unnecessary because if the contrary is the case, it should always be mentioned. So that's just unnecessarily text there. But what's not unnecessary text is if this damage destroys an object or piece of terrain, it explodes, dealing a d6 kinetic damage to all adjacent characters other than you, and knocks them back 1 space. This is a really great feature, and this essentially doubles this mech's particular speed, as we can move every round, pretty much with little effort, 6 spaces. Though, it does say, it says, then deal kinetic damage to any adjacent character or 10 AP to any adjacent object. So you do need to be careful because this will just do damage to anything you end up next to. It doesn't say may, it says then deal. You can choose to move or not to move, but you can't choose to not deal damage. So if your allies are doing things like setting up cover, or there's any cover you want to use, you do have to be really careful with this. But the great thing about the Zheng before is destructive swing. So as long as we deal at least some kind of melee attack during the round, this is actually not that bad. And in fact, if we're dealing with enemies in close proximity, then we hit them, we drop terrain down, and then next turn we just move around the terrain, cause it to explode because we deal with 10 kinetic damage, which is the HP of the cover we create, causing it to then deal an additional D6 kinetic damage and then explode, pushing the enemy away. So there's actually a really fun loop here if the enemy decides not to move away, which after a couple times they'll probably get the hint that they should not be around any cover and try to avoid that, which is actually really good for the Zheng, because that means the Zheng, if they're on you, your choice is to be near cover where the Zheng really has a lot of advantages, or to be out of cover, in which case any gun enemies that you, or any gun allies you have, can just shoot them. So it makes the Zheng really a big nuisance. This is a very strong mech in a lot of ways, with just a crippling weakness against any kind of tech-based attack. So it does make sense for the strength that it generally has, but it's very much a do or die style of mech, which is exactly what the story entails. So that's really funny. Anyway, the active Zhao Li's Ingenuity allows you to kind of break the rule. As a protocol, as you can kind of see here over my shoulder, you can essentially make it where you can use Zhao Li's Tenacity more than once. You get a die, or you get 6 charges essentially, and you expend a charge to use Zhao Li's Tenacity again for going the once per round limit. And then at the end of each of your turns, you actually regain charges for each unique target, whether it's a character, object, or piece of terrain that you deal damage to using Zhao Li's Tenacity, up to a maximum of 6 charges. So the active just allows us to get a lot of movement. In fact, it's really, really easy to just consistently deal damage to terrain and characters with this general feature. And because Zhao Li's Tenacity doesn't prevent reactions, sure, if there are other like melee mechs, they're going to be kind of hurting you. But if they aren't, if they're just a straight up gun mech that doesn't have any way to do Overwatch on you, you're going to utterly wreck them, because you can just circle around them over and over and over, dealing 2 kinetic damage. Sure, that might not generate a bunch of additional charges, but when the enemy can take 12 kinetic damage, that's a lot of kinetic damage to just take. Like, sure, you'll have 1 charge at the end of that round, but that's okay, because you can just, loop around an enemy a few times and do 12 kinetic damage. An absurdly powerful effect, if you ask me personally. It's funny, it's goofy, it's not necessarily always practical, but it's a thing you can do. And 12 damage is a lot of damage. In fact, if there's any kind of terrain you just don't particularly like, you can just, again, loop around it, dealing some damage to it really, really fast. I mean, that's 120 kinetic damage, technically. Now, of course, not all terrain is necessarily like destructible. For instance, a wall might be reduced to rubble, which cannot really be damaged any further, and so it might not count for this feature. There's a lot of things, like you can't just say I damaged the ground beneath me. That's not necessarily how terrain works in Lancer, but there are all kinds of things that kind of count as terrain, that mini maps, including in the various modules available for this game, that do have lots of terrain that can be damaged. So, I do think that this is really good and a very fun feature. So overall, at base, the Zheng is a very interesting mech style. While I do indeed hate its general design, I think it just, because it's now an official mech frame that you can print up, you're not printing up this pile of garbage, right? You're printing up an actual default mech frame. I wish we got that image so that we could get a better idea rather than this thing. But, it's cool for the story. And again, I know your mech frame doesn't have to look like the pictures do, but the pictures really help spark the imagination. And this does not spark joy for me personally. Moving on to the rest of the license, we start off with a pretty cool weapon. I always love weapons in the first license level. This is the Tiger Hunter Combat Sheath. This is essentially like metal plates you put around your mech's fists to do damage. And the really cool thing about this particular weapon, it's a main weapon, but it allows you to attack 2 targets at the same time, and they can be used even while jammed. Since many tech attacks do jam or have the ability to jam, this is an insanely good weapon for our mech that's already very vulnerable to being hacked. So this just kind of removes one of the frequent negative things that can happen from losing, any kind of systems-based save, which makes it really good. And jammed is a very powerful debuff in the game. So, it's pretty cool. And it does a really good amount of damage too. A D3 plus 2 is not a lot for a main weapon, I have to admit, but because you can do this against 2 targets at the same time, as long as you end adjacent to enemies, you're really good. And actually, this makes this a particularly good main weapon for any kind of larger style mechs. If you have a size 2 or even size 3 mech, then you're adjacent to a good number of enemies probably a lot of the time, allowing you to very easily get this ability to get 2 hits off frequently. And so the damage is not bad. The threat range is very small, but it makes sense. Your mech is punching after all. Overall, I really don't have a lot to complain about. It's a pretty good weapon and really good weapon, particularly for the Zheng. Then we have Total Strength Suite 1. This is a system to make our mech generally smaller. So with this particular system, which is only a 1-point system, which I gotta say is pretty cheap, it allows you to rip up a piece of the environment and hurl it at a character within range 5 and line of sight. The target must then make an agility save or take a d6 kinetic damage and be knocked back 1 space directly away from you. After you take this action, you then place a size 1 piece of terrain that grants hard cover in a free space next to your target, even if they passed the save. The terrain has 10 HP and 5 evasion, pretty standard. Now, if there is a size 1 object or piece of cover adjacent to you, you can actually use that cover as a part of this, but otherwise you just kind of rip a part of the ground or a wall off and to create this. The only time you can't use this is if your character is just not near anything they could physically grab. So not good for space battles or underwater battles. I wouldn't use the Zheng in those situations anyway. So more often than not, this is not going to be a problem. Now, why this is really good for the Zheng specifically is you can then use Zhao tenacity to run up to the enemy and blow up that terrain you just created, dealing damage and pushing them back some more. So yeah, Total Strength Suite is actually really, really good. It's also perfect for cornering enemies, has some really good maneuverability, and of course, just the agility damage you can, or the agility damage, the agility save that makes the enemy take damage. They're always likely to eventually fail the check. So it's very easy. And even if they do succeed the check, you still create the terrain that you can then blow up with Zhao tenacity. So a very powerful system, honestly, a very abusable system we can use with the Zheng, making it utterly perfect for a rank 1 license. Now at rank 2, along with the Zheng, we have the Molten Wreath. This is probably very familiar to many of you who have been looking up any kind of builds. It's a very good melee weapon mod, probably one of the best melee weapon mods in the game. It's 2 system points. It can be put onto any melee weapon, which is really good. And once per round, after you hit a character with this weapon, you take an additional 1 heat, and it projects a superheated cone, size 3 cone or 3 cone, oriented it away from your target in a direction of your choice. Your target and any characters caught up in this cloud take 2 explosive damage. So this just does 2 extra explosive damage on the enemy that we hit. Only once per round, but just having Molten Wreath, which for 2 system points, insanely good, to just deal 2 additional explosive damage. Sure, you take one heat, but that's really not like with Nuclear Cavalier in the game. That's honestly what people want half the time. So Molten Wreath is really, really good because you can build up heat really reliably and just do consistently 2 extra damage to the enemy you're hitting, if not more enemies if they happen to be close to anyone. So Molten Wreath is insanely good. It's a really good weapon mod for any melee based builds you might be going for. So, just something to keep in mind, though it does say specifically any characters caught up in this cloud, which does mean this does do friendly fire. So be careful while using it, but honestly, that's probably not going to be a problem more often than not. Also at rank 2, we have the Total Strength Suite 2. This is another really good one if we are going grappling anyway. So, very particular. And I definitely can think of like the Blackbeard or other grappling frames where this is really good. But for 2 system points as a protocol, we can deal an additional d6 kinetic damage to any character we're currently grappling. This is insanely good, especially for the Blackbeard, but can be good on the Zheng. Not necessarily as good as Total Strength Suite 1, but I can see this one being particularly powerful on this mech, and it's just very good. It also gives that strength that, like, our mech is so strong, we're literally crushing the enemy in our grasp. It's very, very cool. I really like this one in particular. So I definitely am going to recommend it. And for 2 system points, this is actually a pretty cheap buy. So if you're going Blackbeard, I would go 2 ranks into the Zheng purely to pick this up because it's just going to make your build even better. And behind me is a weapon we're going to be looking at here in a moment. It's a super heavy, really good. But I do want to state before we get to this that if you're enjoying this content, please leave a like. In fact, if you find any other Lancer content or TTRPG content out there, please leave a like. I want TTRPGs to be more of a thing, especially games like Lancer that really doesn't get as much time in the sun as it really should. And the only way we're going to get more people to notice these kind of games is by interacting with this kind of content more frequently. So share, like, do whatever, comment. As long as we're telling the algorithm that people like this content, it's going to get this kind of content out to more people. And it doesn't have to be just my videos. Anyone's videos that you particularly enjoy, leaving a like really does help. But if you like my content specifically, then I do recommend a subscribe. I talk about all kinds of tabletop games, predominantly Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but I do love covering Lancer. And even though this is the last frame I've yet to fully cover in the game, which I will be doing here soon, I will be doing some Lancer builds and maybe looking into some of the third-party content. So if you're really interested to really dig into Lancer, I do recommend the sub to this channel. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about the third license level with the DD288, or the Devastator Demolition Weapon 228 or 288. Now this is a super heavy weapon, and you might be like, BLG, that weapon does a d6 kinetic damage. That's the worst super heavy weapon I've ever seen. Well, that's not how this weapon works. So this particular profile is for its uncharged form. And while it's uncharged, it can actually be used as a skirmish. So this is essentially fist form. This just does fist damage, essentially. And it's a d6 that does reliable 3, which is actually pretty good. Though, as a quick action, you can change its profile to the charged form, which we're going to look at here in a moment. And while it's charged, you're benefiting from soft cover, which is really good, and you become slowed. Additionally, you gain 2 heat at the start of your turn while it's charged. So you do need to have a decent heat capacity. You want to really invest your engineering if you're going to be using this kind of weapon. But what makes this particularly good is because this is on the Zheng license. If the Zheng is using this particular weapon, you can run up to an enemy, maybe even use your tenacity if you're not close enough, then hit them with, your fist, and then charge this particular weapon so that you are, one, going to get the Devastator swing cover, which is going to give you hard cover from one direction and soft cover from every other direction, meaning enemies have a minimum 1 difficulty to hit you. Now, you do become slowed, which is a little bit unfortunate, but you do get to charge up your weapon to do massive damage. Because in the charge profile form, this weapon gets a massive reach increase going up to threat range 3 from the threat range 1 that it was before. So Something about charging this weapon just gives it way more reach. I actually don't know. Maybe we swing our giant hammer arm so hard that the wind pressure damages enemies. The threat range increase is a little weird, but what's not weird and which is really cool is the 4d6 plus 8 explosive damage. That is absolutely insane. And on top of this, on hit, this weapon deals 30 AP kinetic damage when it hits an object or piece of terrain, making this a really good bunker buster, which is a very good thing to have on some kind of missions. Now, if this destroys an object or piece of terrain, they explode, dealing a d6 kinetic damage to all adjacent characters and then knocking them back one space. The weapon loses its charge when you hit a target and when you disperse its charge as a free action, or when you become stunned or shut down. Stunned is particularly important and when talking about the Zheng because it can be stunned pretty easily with some of the tech stuff that can happen to it. So you do have to be careful and you don't want to charge because you can't charge this weapon necessarily. Or I guess you could charge it. Yeah, you could charge it as a overcharge, funny enough, and then use this as a full barrage, which is something you could always do. But you do need to really be careful when going that route because you can burn up, a lot of the extra heat. And this does have some defensive qualities while it is currently charged. So there are many ways you can use the DD288, which I particularly like. But you know what's even more insane than any of this? It gets reliable 8, which is really cool. I mean, that plus 8 we're essentially always doing, even if we miss. But what's even more ridiculous than that is knockback 8. Any enemy hit by this gets sent flying. Like 8 hexes in Lancer is a massive distance. Like in lore, that's a massive distance that could potentially punch an enemy over a skyscraper. That's how insane 8 hexes is range wise. So that's really, really powerful. And if you do additional damage, I know that there are other frames out there or other licenses that give you things for knocking enemies into like a object or piece of terrain. That pairs with this perfectly. You can get the enemy to the terrain real easy. In fact, this is honestly a really good weapon to pick up on the Caliban. It's really solid, if you ask me personally. I really do like the DD288. I think it's really good. I love how flexible it is. And it has some defensive qualities, some hyper-aggressive offensive qualities. It's perfect for the Zheng, honestly. I think it's a particularly good weapon with, honestly, not a lot of cost. I mean, 2 heats just to have it charged up is really not that bad. Sure, you have to charge it every time you want to do the big hit. But like I said, you could always overcharge into a charge. Then you can punch with it, which is really solid. So I think this is a particularly good weapon, a particularly strong weapon, and one I would consider for some other licenses. And finally, Total Strength Suite number 3. Now, traditionally on this channel, I have not liked the final whatever on a particular license, typically a system. They're not the track record hasn't been great. A lot of the things I just haven't liked. This one is not so bad. For 3 system points, you can end a grapple, pushing the other character 5 spaces in any direction and then knocking them prone. Just automatic prone out of grapple is really good, honestly. Now, this movement may pass through spaces occupied by other characters, but it must end in a free space so you can toss enemies past their allies, for instance. And all characters they pass through must make a hull save or become prone as well. Now, if your target collides with an object or piece of terrain, they stop and they take a d6 kinetic damage and must pass a hull save or become stunned until the end of their next turn. So even though this is a full action, I mean, it's grapple and then throw. This is very powerful. Just the ability to knock an enemy prone is going to cause a lot of trouble for that enemy in many ways. And the fact that you can toss this character past other enemies and knock them all prone like a bunch of bowling pins is really good. But the fact that you can throw an enemy into a wall and they have to roll a hull save or become stunned is good. And even if they don't become stunned, they're still prone. So in a particularly close quarters map, this is really good. Now, 3 system points is a lot, and I don't know if necessarily I would use this on the Zheng unless we had a little bit more system points to go with, which, is always possible. But I think this one is solid. I think for a grappling mech, this is a particularly powerful one, though it is a full commitment mostly to knock a bunch of enemies prone. So this is a teamwork ability, which is really good in many ways and is something that I'm not necessarily against, but this one has a lot of the feeling of especially because you can slam an enemy into a wall to stun them. This feels like something that players will want to use to be hyper aggressive, but in actuality, it's not meant for hyper aggression. It's more meant for either repositioning an enemy to a very disadvantageous position or setting that enemy up to be absolutely destroyed by your allies. So I do like this one a lot. And this is especially potent against enemies that have already acted in the round, unless you're at the bottom of a round. But, this one is just a little bit more nuanced than some of the other ones. And so be aware that this is 3 system points for a little bit of a higher skill profile than some players might be capable of making use of. But other than that, I think it's a very powerful feature. But yeah, that's going to be it for the Zheng. And we've now covered everything to date. Now, whenever new licenses do come out, I'm definitely going to cover them. So, stay tuned, subscribe to the channel if you want to see everything new with Lancer as it comes out. I am probably going to be doing some builds. I want to do a little bit of build crafting just to see, just to get a really good feel for it. I did get to play Lancer for we have a full season on my channel, 10 live play episodes on the channel of Lancer, and we got to see a lot. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to play more Lancer in the near future, but tabletop takes a lot of time. We try to cover many different games here on the channel, and of course, Pathfinder is one of our mainstays, so we tend to go back to that every off season or every on season. I guess everything else would be the off seasons. But if you want to see Lancer content, we do have a full live play. I do have a video for every frame now and variant frame currently in the game. And in addition to that, I'll be probably looking into doing some builds or third-party content or whatever new releases are coming out soon, which I do hear that there is something in the works currently. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.